episode of the Confidence Sessions. And today I have the honor of reintroducing you to the incredible John David Mann. And if you remember from a couple of episodes back, he is the co-author of more than 30 books, including 4 New York Times bestsellers. You heard that right. And 5 national bestsellers. His classic 2008 parable, The Go-Giver, which is co-authored with Bob Berg, earned the 2017 Living Now Book Awards Evergreen Medal for its contribution to positive global change. And today he's here to talk to us about his upcoming release, Cold Fear. Welcome to the Confidence Sessions, or back to the Confidence Sessions, John.
Thank you. It's really, really good to be here.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so this book is something really new for you, and it's a shift into writing a thriller, a new type of novel. I know that you've done a lot of parables before in the past, and before we hit record, you described this book and this series, Steel Fear was the first, as a gigantic parable. Can you give us a little bit of background and insight into what that means?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, it is hugely different. I didn't even know, I think, when I started, just how different a path this is. This isn't like writing a different kind of book. This is almost like a whole different kind of career, different kind of activity. It's sort of like climbing, I was saying to you earlier, climbing the gentle sloping hill in your neighborhood park versus scaling Mount Everest. For years, my wife used to tell me, you'd be great as a novelist. And I would think, you've got to be kidding me. It seemed, to me, the idea of writing a novel seemed like an insurmountable mountain. How do people do that? I couldn't imagine it. I honestly was so intimidated by the idea. Like 400 pages, you keep track of all these characters and all these plot lines, and you make up all this stuff. And how do you do that? So I thought it was an impossible thing. And now here I am. I'm working on my third right now. I'm about to release the second. It is different. I've, as you say, over 30 books, and they were all nonfiction. I wrote memoirs, I wrote business books, I wrote parables, as you know, which are like little stories that illustrate particular principles. This is a whole new beast. And I came into it really through my friendship with Brandon Webb, former Navy SEAL. We'd written a bunch of nonfiction books together. I wrote his memoir, Red Circle, which was my first New York Times bestseller, actually. And we wrote, I think, 7 books in, one after the other, all nonfiction. Memoirs of other SEALs he'd known, military memoirs, books about principles to apply in life and business, one about mastering fear, one about total focus. But way back when we first started talking, he said to me one day, would you ever be interested in writing a novel, writing a thriller? And I immediately, my voice said, yes, of course. And my brain was going, no, you don't know how to do that. It's impossible. But so we kind of held that thought for a decade. And then we co-wrote Steel Fear, the first one last year. And we co-wrote this one. We're a writing team for these thrillers. And it's funny, they are, in a way, like gigantic parables to me. Steel Fear, the first one that came out a year ago, it's, on the face of it, it's a thriller. It's a crime novel. It's a story about a disgraced, traumatized Navy SEAL who stalks a serial killer aboard an aircraft carrier in the midst of the Pacific Ocean. It's like a gigantic locked room mystery, only the locked room is a ship the size of the Empire State Building with 6,000 people on board.
Wow.
And so, this is a crime novel.
Okay, so where do those ideas come
It's
from?
also a leadership parable. It's also a book about leadership disguised as a crime novel. I wrote a piece in Crime Reads, the online journal, about my descent into crime fiction and how it's kind of like a parable.
All right, so you mentioned that this novel is a leadership novel that is actually disguised as a crime novel, which I'm having a really hard time wrapping my head around.
Yeah. So this is the first book. Steel Fear that we're talking about, and it was inspired by a series of true events. Inspired by it takes them quite a bit further in fiction than they were in fact. But Brandon was serving on an aircraft carrier back in the mid '90s. This is before he was a SEAL. He was a rescue swimmer and a sonar operator on a helicopter crew. And it was when women had just been integrated on board on ship's crews back in, as I say, the mid '90s. So he was in one of the very first deployments where they had uh, female jet aircraft pilots, fighter pilots who were women, and they had this whole sort of cultural dilemma or the shift that they were grappling with. You know, how do you house hundreds of women along with thousands of men aboard this ship for months at a time? They hadn't done this before. So it was a culture shock in some ways. And on that deployment, there was a series of strange events. There was a sexual predator on board. There was a guy who would sneak into the women's bathroom areas, switch off the lights, the shower areas, switch off the lights and go in and grope somebody and then run. And it was
Oh my
horrifying.
gosh.
And what made it even, he did this over and over, five, six, 7 times. What made it even more horrifying was they never caught him. They never knew who it was. And eventually it stopped. And that was it. That was never, never went anywhere after that. And at the time, Brandon thought, oh, what if these were murders? Because as buttoned down as a naval culture is, they were in no way, shape, or form equipped to deal with sort of domestic violent crime or assault of crime like that. So it was just a horrifying situation. So he had this idea, serial killer on an aircraft carrier that he carried, for a couple of decades until he and I put it into action. So on that deployment, Brandon experienced just all kinds of misery. The place was a wreck. The people were miserable. There was fighting. There was bickering. The place wasn't kept well. It was kind of dirty. It was just really an awful experience. A year later, he went on a second tour on a different aircraft carrier. And he thought, oh, this is going to be just 1,000 times worse. The first carrier was a brand new nuclear vessel. It was like the best in its class. And that was really terrible. This was a much older carrier, an oil burner, not a new carrier, and it was just going to be miserable. And it was fantastic. It was great. It was the 6 months of like heaven. He was just stunned at how time flew and what a fantastic experience it was. And he thought about it later and he realized the only difference was the captain. That was it. The captain on the second carrier took time out every day to get on the PA system, the 1MC they call it, and talk to the whole crew and tell them, and alert them, and inspire them, and tell them what was going on, where they were going that day, what they were doing, highlight certain individuals or departments for praise, and give them a pep talk, and just basically include them in what it was this mission was all about. On that first deployment, he never heard the captain's voice once on the PA system. The guy was just a weak leader. He wasn't a villain, but he was just a mediocre leader. And what Brandon saw was the same thing that I've seen in business, which is that the person at the top of the organization can completely determine the spirit, quality, behavior, attitude, and culture of the whole organization. It's just such a powerful position. So I brought that into the story. We brought that into the story. In Steel Fear, there is a real villain. There is a seriously evil character who is doing very, very terrible things to innocent people. Yeah, he's a serial killer. But there's another villain too, different kind of villain, which is the captain, who's not an evil man, but he's a mediocre leader. And it's his abdication of leadership, his default of leadership, that is what allows this horrifying plot to unfold. Yeah, so it's leadership great and terrible. That's kind of the subtext
And I
of
was
the
getting
novel.
getting chills while you're talking about it because I've had experiences with leaders like that. And
Yeah,
leaders do make all of the difference when you can pull the right people together. And the connection that you just made to the way that people run businesses
yeah,
has really probably made people's ears perk up while they're listening to this.
yeah,
The lesson in that is so powerful. And I think it sounds like what your novel is really demonstrating is just how bad things can get when
Yeah.
people don't step in that have that power and responsibility.
Yeah. People who step in, who seriously put the interests of their people, of their crew first. Like that's their first priority. And in the book, in Steel Fear, in the original book, here, I'll give an audio visual aid. Steel Fear, for those of you
There
at
it
home who are
is.
seeing this, Steel Fear, there's not only the captain who is a terrible leader, but there's also Finn is the hero of the story. Finn is the SEAL, the damaged, traumatized SEAL. Finn also has memory of another captain in his past who was the opposite, who was exemplar, who was fantastic. That's modeled very much on the captain that Brandon actually experienced in real life. We even gave him the same name, actually. So there are these two different captains, one in the present and one in his flashbacks in the story. There's also a command master chief in the story who's another kind of leader. There's a helicopter squadron CO, commanding officer, who is another kind of leader. There are about half a dozen different leaders, people in leadership positions in the book, that are kind of a range of different qualities and examples of leaders. So it's almost like an operating manual of leadership, the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Oh, so for everybody that's listening to personal development books and reading those, nothing wrong with it. But here's your opportunity to shift and get the same theme and a lot of lessons in between. I am really actually very curious and want to kind of go back to something that you said when we first started, which was when you and Brandon first chatted and he asked you if you would write this book, you found yourself saying yes, and your head said no. And then it took 10 years to actually get the first book written and off the ground. Why such a long delay?
You know, it's a great question, and I guess there's really a couple of reasons. And I wouldn't know which is primary. One of them is we needed to clear our calendar. I mean, for me to write that first novel, it was like a 2-year enterprise, maybe even more than that, really, because it wasn't just writing the book; it was learning how to write a novel and writing the book. I'd written, over 2 dozen, almost 3 dozen books at that point. So I had a feeling for how to write a book, but not this kind of book. So it took me 2 years to write this thing, and I needed to have the runway clear. And I think that the other reason is that I needed to be a more matured writer. I needed to just develop my chops. I don't think that when Brandon first said it, I don't think I was ready to write a novel. I don't think I was ready to write that novel. I think I needed the time and the growth really to grip onto it and carry it off. It was
Is
funny.
there
So that one took 2 years. Then now we're about to bring out the second one, which has taken 1 year, called Cold Fear. That one's coming out on June 7th. So it's imminent. We'll talk about that one too. And right now I'm working on the manuscript for the third one, which I have about 6 months to write. So this is a telescoping time frame.
But you're obviously getting better at it. So
Well, let's
the
hope so.
the
Yes.
the over not there's no hope. You're doing it. Look at your track record.
Oh, that's
Look
right.
at
These are the confidence sessions, not the hopeful
yes, the
sessions. Yes.
confidence sessions, not the doubtful sessions.
Thanks for reminding me.
Exactly. But you so it took 10 years, and I'm sure that there were some things that you wrestled with, and now 1 year for this second book.
Yeah.
And now you said you're writing another one. And so for people that are listening to understand that, one, people are not always an overnight success. I think it's probably easy to look at you and your accomplishments and say, "Oh my gosh, I want that, and I want it next week, or I want it in 3 months." And the reality is it does take time, and it does take some self discovery to get to that point.
Let me give you a great example. I've told this story before, possibly on your podcast. I can't recall, but the first Go Giver book, which it was really my first published book back in the late 2008. That book, when we first brought it to publishers, was turned down 21 times. 21 different editors in New York said, love it, but no, it's not for us. Or I like the way it starts, but it kind of falls in the middle. Or I like where you're going with this, but I'm not sure the ending works. Or they all said various ways of saying, no, Go away. We don't want your book. We're not publishing it. So 21 rejections. And, the moral of that story is not just be persistent and eventually you'll succeed. The moral of the story is those 21 editors were right, actually, because the book wasn't ready. Um, if one of them had said yes, you never would have heard of it. We wouldn't be doing this podcast. I wouldn't have this career because the book wasn't ready. It had good ideas in it. It had the potential of that book in that manuscript. It was like a gem that was still really rough and muddy and dirty and scuffed. And so we spent, 9, 10 months covering every page with red ink, revising that book, distilling it down, focusing it, getting it clearer, taking out a lot. And then eventually, number 22 said yes, and the book has sold over 1 million copies. So that was an overnight success that took that long to create. And those 1 million copies didn't happen in year one, by the way. They happened over a decade. So fast forward to Steel Fear, the first novel. When I finished the manuscript, first draft, um, I showed it to our agent, and she said, "This is great. You have to cut it." It was 151,000 words. She said, "You got to cut it to 100,000." Well, wait a second. Do that math. 150,000 to 100,000. I said, "You mean like we're taking out every third word?" I mean, how does that work? It was so far from ready. Thank God we had that agent who was also a brilliant editor. If any publisher had said yes to that manuscript, which they wouldn't have, but if they had, it wouldn't have been nominated for a Barry Award. Publishers Weekly would not have called it one of the best crime novels of the year. It would not have made a splash. Lee Child would have not put the endorsement on the cover. You would have never heard of it. And again, I would not have a career as a novelist. It wasn't ready. It was good, but it wasn't ready. And so we had to take it from 150,000 words to 100,000 words. I cut out whole characters, whole plot lines. There's some characters that I loved dearly with all my heart, some scenes that I thought were the best scenes in the book, but they weren't the best scenes in the book. They were extraneous, they were superfluous, they were unneeded, and they hit the floor. And so paring it down to 100,000 words felt like cutting flesh off my arms and legs sometimes. Um, but it made a better book. It made a better book. And that's what kind of personal growth is like. You sometimes you pare away parts of yourself that you're really attached to, but you end up a better person. And so that was the story of Steel Fear. It was my graduate course in how to write a novel and also writing a novel. So with the second book, now here we are, the sequel, Cold Fear. The challenge with that was, well, what do you do for an encore? You know, after the first book, can you do it again? Um, so it's been challenging, but it's been an absolute joy to write. And it didn't take 2 years, and it didn't take the first draft that I turned in. We had to make some changes, but they were nowhere near as draconian as in the first book.
Did you know when you wrote Steel Fear, when you and Brandon co-wrote it, that you were going to have a sequel, that this was going to be a series?
We absolutely planned for it. That was our intention. When the publisher made us an offer, first made the offer to buy the book, they said, we want a 2-book deal. So they actually came to us with a 2-book deal, which we were so thrilled about that because that's what we wanted to do. We wanted this to be a series. This is a big story. The story of Finn the Seal is a real, it's a quest. It's a hero's quest. It's a saga. And every one of the books, the individual books, has its own plot line. It's like a season of a television show. It has its own arc that gets resolved. There's a series of murders that gets worked out. There's a killer who's found. There are mysteries to be solved and clues to be unraveled. But there's also a larger arc to Finn's whole story, which I don't know how many books that's going to take to work out. Maybe 5, maybe 6, maybe 7. I'm not sure yet. But we're working on number 3 right now, and number 2 is about to hit the shelves.
Oh my gosh. What surprised you most about the book in general, Cold Fear? whether it's the characters, something that came out as you were writing, some
Oh,
collaborative experience. I mean, give us all the juicy goodness that we don't see when we
yeah.
read the words on the page.
So some of this is tough to do without spoilers, but I'll say this to start with. Steel Fear all took place on an aircraft carrier, which is, by the way, one of the most bizarre alien environments you can imagine. Most people don't have any idea what that, including me, any idea what that environment is like. 6,000 people shut up in a steel tube the size of the Empire State Building, laying on its side, and dropped in the water for 6 months. Um, so, one of the big challenges in that book was to describe and accurately describe the environment of the aircraft carrier, the physical environment, the cultural environment, the social environment, to describe that in such a way that people in the military who live that life would go, yeah, yeah, he got it right. And also so that you and I and people who'd never experienced that would really experience it, would feel it, would get it. You know, I needed to put the reader on that aircraft carrier. So book two, we were looking for what's the strange environment we're going to go to here. And Brandon told me about a trip he'd taken to Iceland, where he'd gone diving down into a crevice, which is between deep in the water, ice cold water, in a spot where he could touch with his two hands the two continental plates that hold up the Americas and Eurasia. It's the only place on the planet Earth where you can literally touch two continents at once. And Iceland, I thought, that's our next book, Iceland. Iceland is such an unusual, strange, alien environment, both physically, like the volcanoes and the glaciers and the earthquakes, um, and also culturally. It's a fascinating place. The language is fascinating. The people are fascinating. Oldest functioning democracy on the planet. First female head of state on the planet. Lowest crime rate on the planet, which we had fun with because we took that crime rate up by a notch.
Right. Wow.
So we set the book in Iceland, and one of the big challenges for me was I've never been to Iceland. We were writing this in the middle of COVID. I couldn't fly to Iceland. I had to learn Iceland, get into that culture, and give it to you so accurately that people who live in Iceland would go, "Yeah, I recognize this," and people like you and me would say, "Oh, now I know what Iceland is like." So that was really. It's like in the first book, the aircraft carrier almost became a character in the novel. In this book, Iceland becomes a character in the novel Cold Fear. It takes place during the week between Christmas and New Year's during a cold snap in Reykjavik, which is the northernmost capital city in the world, almost touching the Arctic Circle. And Finn is there on a mission, hunting for answers to his troubled past and to memory gaps that he has when he gets embroiled in a mysterious drowning of a young woman that happens in the prologue of the book.
Oh my gosh. So, one thing that I am hearing you say without you saying it out loud is you have an incredible amount of patience. Something I have been learning my entire life, whether it's the writing of the book, the collaborative piece of it, the research that you've had to do. How have you managed? Have you always been patient, first of all? And how have you managed to become more patient so that you can write these amazing novels and the nonfiction books and parables that you've written over the years?
First of all, I mean, you're absolutely right that it does take, to me, it takes great patience. I am not one of these writers who sits down on page one and just starts spitting and it goes boom, 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 the way Mozart used to write music. I'm more like the way Brahms used to write music, torturing over every line. Um, and sometimes it flows, but it's a fairly difficult process to Stephen King describes, I interrupt myself, but Stephen King describes the writing process, writing stories. He says to him a story is an already existing artifact. And it's almost like you're an archaeologist where you're carefully scrabbling in the dirt to unearth something that's already there intact, and your task is to get it out of the earth without breaking it, without messing it up. That is exactly how it feels to me, only it's less out of the earth and more out of the air. It feels to me when I'm trying to come up with a story like this that I am trying to pull this thing that already exists. There's like a story that has its integrity to it. I'm trying to pull it out of the ether, out of the atmosphere, out of the air, and 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 give it substance, get it down onto the page without messing it up, without destroying the process. It's like putting smoke in your pocket. And it feels to me excruciatingly difficult, particularly in the early stages of the process. So part of the fun in a novel is the research, because while you're going through this process of trying to get a sense of what the story is, what is the plot? Why did this woman die? Where is Finn's search going? What is this character all about? While you're trying to kind of get those, and nobody can tell you, you can't go look it up. You have to just sort of sit there patiently and grope for it, try to feel it. It's like throwing a fishing line in a pond that's poked totally still, waiting for the bite. While you're doing that, you can also be over here digging through reams of material, just learning and learning and learning and learning about this strange alien environment, which is really fun. Because there, and I think that a huge part for me of writing a novel is research. Uh, Partly to get facts, but partly because when you bump into strange ideas that you didn't expect, they give you ideas for the story. And I'll give you an example. I knew that Cold Fear opened with somebody drowning. I just had the sense of that. I've always been afraid of the water. I'm not a swimmer. I don't love swimming. I can do it, but I don't love it. Um, I've always, and Brandon, my Navy SEAL friend, is a SEAL. These guys like were born in the water, right? And he grew up on the shore, and water is like his natural element. I find that bizarre, and so drowning fascinates me. So I knew that the story began with this woman, this young woman drowning. Didn't know why, and I knew that at the end of the story there was a titanic struggle that took place in a frozen lake in an effort not to drown. But I wasn't sure. Where is she going to drown? I started researching Reykjavik in the middle of the winter, and I discovered that there was this pond right in the middle of the town. But of course, the pond is frozen. It's thick ice. How are you going to drown in a pond that's covered with ice? And I was poking around this pond online, and I stumbled upon this really cool fact. They keep the northeast corner of the pond thawed all through the winter for the ducks. And I thought, oh, that's where she goes. She slips into that northwest corner under the ice and drowns. And in the prologue of the book, that's what you see. That's what happens. And it kicked off the whole plot. This weird fact that I stumbled on, this duck pond, kicked off the whole thread that unraveled through the rest of the plot. So it's a really fun process. It's almost like a treasure hunt, writing a novel.
It sounds like it. I'm already like, I have to go. I have to read the rest of the book because I had the pleasure of reading, a little bit of it, but not finishing it. I don't like to do a ton of research when I'm having conversations with people for this reason. I love hearing the way that you approach things versus me kind of looking at it from surface level. And the fact that you don't particularly enjoy swimming and have always been fascinated with drowning, but then had to research what that felt like.
Yeah.
Do you have to, almost like an actor would, feel the feelings of the character in order to write that piece and make it believable?
Yeah, I think you absolutely do. One of the things, the early reviews of the book, one thing that's been really gratifying for me is that some reviewers have especially pointed out the female characters. Said really, really well drawn female characters. And I love that because I don't happen to be a female character myself.
You don't
And
say.
yeah, and what do you know? And it's to me, it's people have asked how do you write a woman so convincingly, and you could just as easily ask how do you write an old person, a young person, a black person, an Asian person, a paraplegic, an astronaut, a surgeon. I mean, how do you write anybody who isn't you and make it convincing? And I think the answer is empathy. I think that you really need to. It's not study per se. It's not an intellectual process. I think to be a convincing writer probably is the same traits you need to have to be a convincing actor. Although I don't know about acting, it's not my field. But and that is to you have empathy. I look back on myself as a young man and I don't see a particularly empathetic person. You asked about if I've always been patient. No. I look at my 20-year-old self as a very impatient, impetuous, ambitious, not particularly empathetic person, not cruel, but I don't think I'd really developed much. I didn't have a lot of self knowledge, I don't think, and I don't think I had a lot of other knowledge of people. So, you know, catastrophes and tragedies and hardships, I think, have kind of blunted some of that early impetuousness and, made me feel more for people, get people more. When you go through hard experiences in life, rejections and failures and deaths of people close to you and betrayals and things like that, all those things, I think, they can make you just bitter, but if you embrace them, they make you more empathetic. They make you more appreciative of the human condition. And I think that's the primary toolkit you need as a writer.
How young were you when you started writing professionally?
I actually came late to it. I've sort of been dabbling, I've been editing other people's stuff my whole life. In all the other careers I've been in nutrition and health, and I was a classical musician was my original career, and I've been in sales, and I've been an entrepreneur, and I've been in publishing. I've done a whole bunch of different things, but I always seemed to be the guy who was editing other people's stuff, editing the newsletter, editing the circular, editing the article. I didn't really start writing myself, my own stuff, until you know after the year 2000. It's been in my second half of my life, so in my 50s.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a new career for me, this writing thing.
Did you ever imagine that you would have the success with your writing that you love doing so much?
Um, when we wrote The Go Giver, yes,
You
we
did.
both Bob and I co-wrote that with a friend named Bob Bubberg. Yes, we both imagined that would be huge. We didn't have any reasonable expectation, any reasonable evidence that that would be the case, but we absolutely did expect that. I expect that of the Finn books. I always expect one of my books to be huge. They aren't all, so I get disappointed a lot.
How do
But
you
I
deal
still,
with that? How do you deal with the disappointment?
it is painful sometimes. After as I said, The Go Giver has sold over 1 million copies. That's lovely, but I've also had books that didn't sell over 1 million copies, didn't sell anywhere close to that. Didn't sell over 10,000 copies. Dealing with the disappointment is very difficult because I love every one of these books. They're like my children. If I didn't love it, I wouldn't write it in the first place. Um, I know writers who say, "Oh, I can't read my own stuff," and I have no comprehension of what they're talking about. What? You can't read your own? If you didn't, I love every sentence in Steel Fear and Cold Fear. If I didn't love them, I wouldn't put them on paper, or I wouldn't leave them there for you to read. So when a book doesn't reach a big audience, I'm grievously disappointed. And it's just like all the disappointments in life. You just embrace it, and it becomes a part of deepening your character and giving you motivation to do better.
But I think when you believe in what you're doing and what you're writing, whether it's writing or anything else that people are doing that are listening to this episode, if you have to believe in it first before anybody else does, and you have to be doing it because that's what you love and not because you want some recognition or something from someone else. And I think that really makes all the difference. It doesn't mean that your books, I am a firm believer and truly believe that there are probably books that you have written that didn't do as well, John, that have the potential with Cold Fear to reignite people's fascination and desire to read more of your things, right? It doesn't mean that it won't ever happen. It just means that wasn't the right moment for it. But we see that happen so often with people and artists and
Sure.
musicians.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of my favorite stories in the publishing world is John Grisham. His first novel, A Time to Kill. Um, I don't think it sold over 5,000 copies. I mean, it made barely a ripple in the pond of publishing. And then the second book came out, a little novel called The Firm, which got made into a movie, which probably every breathing soul on the planet has seen. And the movie was a huge hit. And when The Firm became a hit, people went back and read Time to Kill, and then it became a hit. And then they made that into a movie, which was a phenomenal movie with Samuel L. Jackson and Matthew McConaughey and so forth. So yeah, sometimes a later breakthrough sheds new light on earlier efforts. That's true in business. That's true in just in life. It's certainly true in publishing, but that's okay. Every new writing experience is a new opportunity to, I don't know how to say this differently, but just get better. Just get better. Neil Gaiman says this beautiful thing. A wonderful novelist that he admired very much was talking to him once and asked Neil how it was going. He was writing American Gods, I think, and he said, I think I've learned how to write novels." And his friend said to him, "Oh no, Neil, no, you never learn how to write novels. You only learn how to write the novel you're writing."
Wow.
And I think there's great wisdom in that.
It's so true. I think that's true with pretty much everything in life. This is incredible. All right. So, Cold Fear, why should
Cold.
we read it? Why should
So,
we read it? We're jumping back there. Why should we read it? This is
well,
why we're here.
couple of reasons. If you read Steel Fear, then you really want to know what's going to happen with Finn. Where is his life going? Finn is in some ways he's a lost soul, and in some ways he's a hero, and he's becoming more and more fascinating to me every time. Coming up with the character of Finn took me a couple of years, and the inspiration of Finn, or the birth of Finn, was what set writing the book in motion. That's what got Brandon and me actually in gear to write the first book, was Finn, the character. So yeah, you want to read Cold Fear because you want to know what happens to Finn. But here's another reason: when you read the prologue, and if you get Steel Fear, by the way, Steel Fear is coming out in paperback in a couple of weeks, the original book. So if you get Steel Fear, in the back of the book there are the first few chapters of Cold Fear, book 2. If you read the beginning of Cold Fear, you're going to read about this woman who drowns in the pond. You're going to want to know, why does she do this? Why did this poor thing drown? And you don't find out till the end of the book. You're gonna have to read the whole book to find out why she drowned. But I will tell you this: it's a tragedy, but there's also phenomenal redemption in that. It's also phenomenally heroic, and neither Finn nor the reader is going to really know what that's all about until you get right to the end. So,
And
gotta
it's
buy it,
already
gotta
been
read it.
nominated. Already been nominated for a Barry Award. If someone's not sure and they haven't hit the Google search bar yet to figure out what that is, can you just share with us what that means for this novel?
The Barry Award. Yeah, it's an award. It has several categories, as so many awards do. This is actually for Steel Fear, the first novel, and this is we're one of 10 books nominated for Best First Crime Novel in, I guess it's in the world, but probably English
Wow.
language. And it's a award created by readers, not by publishers or by any big institution. So yeah, it's kind of like Screen Actors Award, SAG Awards for actors, the SAG Awards.
Incredible. Incredible. All right. So you're going to be going on tour. You're going to go on a book tour. This book is releasing Cold Fear on June 7th, which
Yes,
is not that far off from
not
now.
that far off.
Where can people go to pre-order Cold Fear?
Well, we've got a site for the book, simply called coldfearthebook.com. Coldfearthebook.com. You can also get it, wherever books are sold. And we are going on a book tour. It's not a huge tour. Like I've been inundated with letters from friends saying, "Why are you coming to my city?" We're very sorry. We can't go to every city. We're going to New York City. We're going to Houston, going to Dallas, Miami, Portland. It's all on the site, coldfearthebook.com. The tour is actually on the site. And we are actually adding new events continuously. So that will continue to grow. But the book itself you can find on the site and wherever you like to buy books.
Coldfearthebook.com. We will make sure that we link everything in the show notes. Go check out all of John's books, including Steel Fear and his newest book releasing June 7th, Cold Fear, and go see if you can check him out at one of his book tour locations. John, it is always such a pleasure to connect with you, have a conversation, and just really learn from you.
It's always a pleasure, Paula. Thank you for having me back.
You're so welcome. All right, everyone. I will see you next week on another episode of the Confidence Sessions. Don't forget to go check those show notes and get your copy of Cold Fear.